Wow. Hey, much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Appreciate you guys tuning in once again. Appreciate all the support, always. Hope you guys are enjoying all the presentations. Welcome to all my new subscribers. I'm excited about this video and series, the Out of Olmec Theory. We're going to dive deep into the so-called Olmec history here and the culture, the people, their accomplishments. We're going to try to approach this only reading sources, putting it all together, and drawing our own conclusions. I hope this video helps certain people break out of their prejudices, their stereotypes, their biases, their lack of research, their assumptions, opinions. A lot has been said about the so-called Olmec in the past. A lot of so-called scholars and even Pan-African scholars trying to add their conjectures to this. So we're going to try to help with that and show the difference between conjectures and actual facts you can research. I know most of you, all you know about the Olmec is what you see here. This Olmec stone head, large colossal head they found in the jungles of Central America and Mexico. But there's more to the so-called Olmec. I'm going to show you guys they didn't even call themselves that. Olmec is a tag. It's a misnomer. So we're going to get into a couple books. I don't know how many videos it's going to be this series. So again, we're going to try to just learn and research the so-called Olmec instead of just talking about what we think about the Olmec. And that's the biggest point of this series. And maybe out of that, we're going to learn so much. So let's just start reading. So I'm going to start out with this book right here. The book is called The Olmec, Mother Culture of Mesoamerica. This was written by Roman Pina Chan. And before I start reading, but first let me show you what I did, how I got this book right here in PDF form. All right, so over at archive.org, I found the original Spanish version. This book was actually written in Spanish in 1990. As you guys can see here, Los Olmecas, La Cultura Madre. And it has a whole different cover, as you guys can see. But what I did, guys, is I translated. I took about a month and a half and I translated this myself. You know, I try to use, good translators to help me and proofread it as best as I can. But this is what we're about to get into. So again, as you guys can see, it's in Spanish. All right. And again, here is the English version I translated. I literally made the book in English. And I have this book available in my Patreon page for my patrons, the ones who go ahead and support me, just to say thank you for their help. So if you become a patron, you get access to this book and many, many other PDF books that I've read and many videos and more. So feel free to support me that way if you can. If you're not able to, don't worry about it. I still appreciate you guys just tuning in and learning with me. So let's get started in this book. It says here, chapter 1, the background. It says here, the people who live in the region of the rubber towards where the sun rises, near the edge of the sea in the Gulf of Mexico, were known by the Mexica or Aztecs with the name of Olmec Huixtotin in times close to the Spanish conquest. So that's when the Europeans arrived. That's what the Aztec, remember the Aztecs are actually an invading recent tribe too when the Europeans arrived. So they were telling them what they thought, who they thought the ancient people were. And so they were calling them the Olmec Huixtotin. However, listen to this. However, earlier in the same region also settled some people. So before these people called Olmec Huixtotin, there was an earlier people that had settled there who carved huge monolithic altars and colossal heads, as well as the delicate figurines and masks, which we call ancient Olmecs or simply Olmecs. All right. I don't know if you guys saw what he was pointing out here, but I'm going to break it down. He's basically letting you know there was a much more recent, people that were called Olmec or Olmec Huixtotin. Their name, was used on the ancient peoples of Mexico, which eventually we are calling ancient Olmecs or simply Olmecs, as he's saying. There's two different Olmecs. There's the ancient people who never called themselves Olmecs. They just being called that, and that name they got from a recent tribe that came in called Olmecs. These Olmecs, both the ancient and the much more recent historical Olmecs, all right, two different ones, guys, were a small part of Mexico's indigenous past, whose continuity throughout history is still evident in many indigenous languages, and the native clothing, and many customs, and above all, in the many crafts rooted in the distant past. The fact is that in the old mesh of Mexico's social and cultural history, there are invisible threads that unite the indigenous people of yesterday with those of today, who have woven the fabric of the past and the present, given meaning and nationality to today's Mexicans. Okay. So right here, guys, this is major drop we just read. But what is this guy talking about? Who is this guy, right? So before I continue, let's just read this article. It's from the internet, all right? It's somebody's blog, I guess, but very interesting what he was saying in this. Shout out to Warship Red Lion for sending me this, Rob, and bringing this idea into my perspective about the two different so-called Olmec peoples. It says here, 30 secrets of the Olmec civilization, plus how I became friends with the famous author Jim Lowen. The talking heads on TV programs and YouTube documentaries keep on replicating inaccurate speculations about the Olmec civilization made by a gringo archaeologist during the 1940s. They talk about the Olmecs doing this and the Olmecs doing that, when in fact, the invading Olmecs arrived in Tabasco. Listen to this. And southern Veracruz around 1500 years after the first civilization in southern Mexico faded. Yes, that's right. The Olmecs had absolutely nothing to do with the Olmec civilization. All right, what he's saying is what we just read. There was a people that came in much later, and I think we read about them. We're going to talk about that too in this series. We read this in the book Annals of Kentucky by Rufinsky, where he was talking about the Olmecas who had come over, right? So these Olmecas, somebody grabbed their name and dubbed it on the ancient peoples of Olmec. So these Olmecs have nothing to do with the real ancient people of Mexico, who again we know as the Olmec civilization. Unlike virtually everybody who writes and talks about the Olmec civilization, I am partially descended from the people who created that civilization and have thoroughly roamed about its territory. And we are not talking about gringo package stores. At my initial meeting with Dr. Roman Piña Chan and his office at the Museo Nacional de Antropología, so this author we're reading, right, in the book we just came from that I translated, he was actually director of the Museo Nacional de Antropología, all right, the anthropology museum in Mexico. He quickly realizes the close cultural ties of the Choctaws, Chickasaws, Alabamas, and Creeks with the Gulf Coast peoples of Mexico. Okay, major drop, because they're trying to tell you they went extinct. Oh, they went extinct. He then altered my fellowship syllabus to focus on that region. Those on-site studies were just the beginning of a lifetime of study. Okay, so the curator of the Museo Nacional de Antropología, all right, that's the book we're reading. I translated it into English, guys, just for you, exclusive here. It says here, Dr. Roman Piña Chan, my fellowship coordinator in Mexico, wrote the first internationally published book on the so-called Olmec civilization. The book, originally entitled The Mother Culture, listen to this, was written in advance of the 1968 Mexico City Olympics. to take advantage of the millions of tourists coming to Mexico that year. Dr. Piña Chan told me that the first limited printing in Spanish, La Cultura Madre, revealed that the gringo version of early Mexican history had so saturated the world that the title had to be modified to include Los Olmecas for most people to know what the book was about. Do you guys hear that? He had to change the name of his book because he only had the mother culture or La Cultura Madre as the title. He wasn't talking about no so-called Olmec because he knew that wasn't their name. But because the book wasn't getting probably no attention, it wasn't selling, nobody was really paying attention to it, they didn't know what he was talking about until he changed it into Los Olmecas or the Olmecs, mother culture. Then everybody's like, oh, that's what you're talking about. He had to use that fake tag, is what he's saying, in order for people to pay attention to his book. And that's exactly what we're doing with this series, guys. If I don't name it the out of Olmec theory, and we don't say we're literally talking about the so-called Olmec to try to talk about the ancient people of Mexico, you guys wouldn't know what I was talking about. You would probably say, but what about the Olmec, Kurimeo? Well, now we're really going to learn about the so-called Olmec, all right, from this guy's book and many others. It says here, from the very beginning of the discovery of this early civilization in 1905 by Mexican archaeologist Leopoldo Batres, Mexican scholars had known that the Olmecs were Nahua-speaking barbarians. You guys hear that? Who invaded southern Mexico around 1150 AD. That's the real Olmecs. And you guys been using their name. They made you do that on purpose so you don't know who the real ancient people are. They want to give credit to this invading barbarian tribes, the Olmecas, that came around 1150 AD. However, the overwhelming power of United States culture brainwashed the world into thinking that the Olmecs did it. The faulty version of Mexican history promulgated in the United States became its official history in the rest of the world. One thing that clearly bugged Dr. Piña Chan was that North American and European archaeologists focused on the elite when working in Mexico. They really didn't care about 95% of the Mayas lived or what happened to them. Thus, to this day, very few archaeologists in the United States are aware that illiterate Maya commoners were allowed to make only shell-tempered redware because it needed less wood for firing. The arrival of large numbers of Maya commoner refugees in North America, listen to this, would be marked by the sudden appearance of a shell-tempered redware, and that exactly is what marks the beginning of the Mississippian culture in the Southeast. All right, you guys hear that? We're gonna get into some real truth here. Break it down, let's get specific. Let's stop generalizing. Two of the most poignant moments during my fellowship occurred during the first meeting with Dr. Piña Chan. He, his graduate assistant, Alejandra, and I were going through the books on the southeastern Indians, which I had given him as a propina academica. While looking at the pages on Etowah mounds, he came to the famous marble statues found under Mount C. He asked me, Ricardo, why did your Indios make marmel or marble statues of Maya slaves? Then when reading about Mountville, Alabama, Dr. Piña Chan suddenly uttered a mild Spanish profanity, stood up, turned around, and then pulled out his book on the Toltec people, Los Toltecas. As he thumbed through his landmark text, he pointed out numerous artifacts and artistic symbols which were almost identical in the Toltec capital of Tula, the famous Tula. We came from Tula, and this famous mountain complex in northwestern Alabama. All right, guys, see the connections here, right? Dr. Piña Chan also wrote the guidebook to the Museo Nacional de Antropología. All right, still used today. Still used today. Oh, we got a spoiler alert. It says an ancient log tomb, identical to the one on the cover of the Spanish language version of Piña Chan's book, was also found under Mount C at Etowah Mound in Cartersville, Georgia. The collapsed tomb contained the two marble statues. You guys see, same things. And you guys already know, if you haven't seen my ancient Georgia video, the land and the people there, how it was a multicultural place of different peoples from South America, the Caribbean, even North America there. There was people from Peru there. Like this is a ancient, majestic land there in Georgia before all the man-made lakes, right? We read about. The Soke or Soke people have always claimed to be the founders of the mother culture, but also admitted that several distinct ethnic groups lived in its towns and villages. Yes, that's the same Soke as the Soke River in northeast Georgia. Listen to that. English speakers wrote the word as Soke or Soki or Suki, but it is correctly pronounced as Sejoke. Interestingly enough, Ishke is also what the Norse called the Sea Sami, the indigenous Asiatic people of northern Scandinavia, who taught the Norse how to build ocean-going sailing ships. All right, we'll talk about them in our next article. You guys see that? That's a whole other video we're going to get into. But you see the connections? He just showed the correlation with people in Mexico and Georgia. I already told you who's the ancient navigators, who taught who. These same people taught the so-called Norse how to navigate. Come on. The Vikings, who's the so-called Vikings? Come on now. According to the Muskogee leaders of the Soki migration legend, many of their people fled to the mountains of Chiapas when the Nahuas invaded their lands. The Olmecs, when the Olmecs came and invaded them, and the so-called Aztecs and all these people. But their own ancestors migrated northward out of Tabasco. So in my genealogy, I got the Chorotega bloodline. The Chorotegas had the same story, that they were in Cholula, which was so-called Toltec land and civilization, and that Nahua-speaking people came and made them flee. The word Chorotega means those who fled from Cholula or inhabitants of Cholula. Same story. So some came down and some went up to the north, right, to the states. So it says, but their own ancestors migrated northward out of Tabasco. The barbarians practiced human sacrifice and ate their victims. All right, so who was really practicing all this sacrifice? The Soke were the last branch of the Creek Confederacy to enter the southeastern United States. That sure does sound like the Olmecs drove them out. All right, we're talking about the historical Olmecs who were actually barbarians. We're not talking about the ancient people of Mexico. So this is what I want to get across now. Hopefully you guys understand now that we can't be using that word Olmec because we're literally giving credit to these other tribal people that came much later. All right, so continuing. So you got this picture right here. We're going to learn about this guy right here. Check out this guy right here. So it says, this is Matthew William Sterling, right? Matthew William Sterling was an American ethnologist, archaeologist, and later an administrator at several scientific institutions in the field from 1928 to 1957. He was director of the Smithsonian Institute of Bureau of Ethnology, okay? He was what? The director of the Smithsonian. Now, guys, do I have to say anything? What is the Smithsonian known to do, right? Hide and lie and make up a fake history, which at that time included all of the institution's archaeological expeditions. He was in charge of all that stuff during that time. In 1938, he and his wife Marion went on a vacation in southern Mexico where they visited Tres Zapotes. Sterling arranged to have himself photographed at many stone carvings and earthen pyramids. When he returned to Washington, D.C., he published a report in which he claimed to have been the first person to theorize, or he claimed he took this honor right on himself, to theorize that the ruins in western Tabasco, he's talking about the ancient ruins of the ancient people of Mexico, right, were older than the Maya sites. He also coined the words Olmec civilization. All right, this is the guy, a Smithsonian director, who made up the word for the ancient people. He's the one that started calling them Olmec. And he got that name from who? From invading barbarian tribes that came much later. Readers were not told that Mexican archaeologists excavated the sculptures, causing many assuming that Sterling had made the discovery. So he didn't even go do the excavations, guys. Listen to what he's going to say. Matthew and Marion Sterling returned to Tabasco numerous times after 1938 to excavate Olmec civilization sites that had been overlooked by Mexican archaeologists. Unfortunately, they never used radiocarbon dating on these sites and never consulted with Mexican anthropologists. This is what the Smithsonians were doing. It was Matthew Sterling who also created the myth that the Olmec civilization mysteriously disappeared before the Maya civilization rose. You guys hear this hijack? Again, just like everybody else, right? Always disappearing. So you see how much hijack this guy's bringing into the history of the so-called Olmec, or the ancient people of Mexico, who he started calling Olmec. And then he said, well, they disappeared anyway, so we don't know nothing about them, forget about them, right? That's just not true. The people who created the first civilization evolved into a second, third, and fourth cultural periods. Again, you're still here. You're still here. The second and third were more sophisticated than the first, but no longer built massive earthen pyramids and seemed to have less centralized control. All right, so he's giving some chronologies, all right? From 400 BC to 200 AD, the second cultural phase is called the Epi-Olmec culture by gringo archaeologists, and the late formative period by Mexican anthropologists, all right? They don't call them Olmecs, see? The towns and villages were very similar to those built in South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and eastern Tennessee. A few centuries later, this is also when the peoples of southern Mexico began developing a writing system, whereas the later Maya writing system has now been translated, the earlier one in southern Mexico has not. They don't know, but remember, Le Plongeon used ancient Egyptian to translate the old Maya. The Greek writing system used in 1735 appears to be a combination of the Epi-Olmec writing system and one used in southern Sweden during the Bronze Age. Where? In southern Sweden. So who went over there? Come on, guys. This is what I've been saying. Perhaps if I can ever translate all the Greek writing system, scholars will be able to translate the Epi-Olmec system. So I want to just read this last paragraph. Very interesting what he says here. It says in 800 AD, the Chinchonal caldera in northwestern Chiapas exploded. Much of western Chiapas, southwestern Tabasco, and southern Veracruz was incinerated. Do you guys hear this? This is a major cataclysm. When? 800 AD? Huh. Right when the Dark Ages start happening, right? So-called Dark Ages. Their new reset. The reset, huh? The reset, and then came the Renaissance. Then came the medieval times. So something happened here in 800 AD, including the capital city of Palenque. The cataclysm ended the occupation of cities and large towns in the former realm of the Olmec civilization, so-called, right? Many, many thousands of its residents were killed almost instantly. The primary impact zone was unsuitable for agriculture for many years. This is the real end of the Olmec civilization in Mexico. But it was to continue, again, it was to continue in southeastern North America. You're still here, guys. How do you feel about that? You're still here. You survived so much, and then they reclassified you.
An ancient colossal head, discovered in the southeastern lowlands of Mexico during the 19th century, was destined to introduce a new phase of Mesoamerican archaeology. It was the first observed example of an art style represented by later finds in the area. Each new discovery brought researchers closer to the sites where long-vanished artisans had worked. These sites, while of basically Mesoamerican pattern, as evidenced by pyramids, stone sculpture, and carved jade, displayed characteristic differences. The monolithic flat-topped altars, the sculptured monuments, the art style itself could not be classified as Mayan, Zapotec, or Aztec. By 1932, it became obvious that a separate and distinctive culture was represented. It was given the name of Olmec. As far as we know, the Olmec heartland lay in the lowland Gulf Coast region in a small area of 200 by 70 miles. It included southern Veracruz, northern Tabasco, and the small volcanic area of the Tuzla Mountains, next to the sea. Here, high civilization in Mexico very likely made its earliest appearance. Three major Olmec sites support this theory, the bulk of the evidence deriving from La Venta. About 12 miles inland from the Gulf of Campeche, in the Tonala River, lies the island of La Venta. In this remote setting, containing only 2 square miles of dry land, was situated the oldest major ceremonial center of prehistoric Mexico. Archaeological studies at La Venta produced a number of provocative facts. The Olmecs had built on a gargantuan scale. Although clay was their main construction material, they made great use of stones, weighing up to 40 tons, which had to be transported at least 80 miles to this alluvial coastal plain. The stone was used for columns, for stelae, for intricately sculptured altars depicting ritual scenes. Serpentine slabs were found buried in deep pits. At higher levels, precious jade objects in vast quantity. Nothing was found in the main site area to indicate that a populace had lived at La Venta, but tomb-like structures suggested that some individuals were buried there. Archaeologists concluded that La Venta was a detached ceremonial center of the kind which abounded in prehistoric Mesoamerica, built by non-resident laborers, maintained by a small corps of attendants, and administered by the priesthood. Only when radiocarbon dates were secured did the unique significance of the site become apparent. It was built about 800 BC, thus predating by several hundred years any previously known Mesoamerican religious center of comparable development. Construction was carried out in 4 phases, occurring about 100 years apart and following plans of the utmost precision. About 400 BC, all work at La Venta ceased. The priests and attendants disappeared. The outlying population failed to return for either work or worship. No one knows why. We do know that for about 4 centuries, a very ambitious building program was successfully carried out under the direction of a small dominant group. La Venta, therefore, apparently launched the long series of Mesoamerican theocracies which lasted until 1520, when Cortez destroyed the Aztec civilization. Much remains to be discovered about these precocious Olmecs, where they came from, what their religious motivations were, why they vanished with scarcely a derivative trace. We can only attempt to visualize their hour in history based on the archaeological findings at La Venta.
All right, so we come back to the book. Now we know the whole history, who Roman Piña Chan is, what he was saying, okay? We were reading what he was saying, that there was 2 different Olmec groups. There was a barbarian. That was the real historical Olmec, came around 1150 AD, as we just read, all right, in that other article. And then there's the ancient people who got called Olmecs, but that was not their name, all right? We're going to pick up where we left off. However, the indigenous Mexico of yesterday and today is intimately associated with geography. Since ancient times, Mexico has possessed a varied range of physical environments and natural landscapes, soils, climates, and vegetation. Due to its rugged topographic configuration, in which mountainous massifs and intermountain valleys predominate, combined with rolling hills and extensive coastal plains and plains, configuration or relief of the Mexican territory can be divided for study into several physiographic regions or provinces, in which, on the other hand, since pre-Hispanic times, man has always found the most suitable places to live, all right? And again, remember, guys, I translated this myself. You can proofread it with the original if you know Spanish, or you can just verify it yourself. Just in case you see some grammar errors or certain things misspelled, just bear with me on that, okay? Throughout these regions, thousands of archaeological sites have been located that indicate the presence of man in different times, which inform of the different societies that existed in the Mexican territory. And there are also many historical sources that tell us what groups did before and after the conquest, in addition to the groups that still survive today in the same areas of their ancestors. All right, so that was an important point. Again, we've gone over it again, even when they're finding things buried so many feet below, showing the different time periods, right, of people occupying the same location. It doesn't necessarily mean that these were all the same people always, or that it wasn't an enemy at one time that conquered, and then another people regained the land back, or another enemy came, you know. So that's why I say about generalizing. There's so much to think about. It's complex. History is very complex, guys. The earliest inhabitants of the Mexican territory that date back to the lower Paleoamerican period, 2000 1000 BC, they lived by gathering plants and animals and mainly occupied the oldest prehistoric sites in Tlapacoya, Valley of Mexico, where remains of homes, bones of extinct animals, mastodon, bear and deer, obsidian flakes, and other artifacts made of pink stones, andesite, and quartz have been found. Also, a human skull with marked dolichocephaly or elongated shape was found. Carbon-14 dates obtained for the site dated to 24,000 to 20,000 years before the Christian era. From the archaeological evidence of Tlapacoya and other localities, we can say that the first settlers of Mexico obtained from their habitat some animals such as the mastodon, the American horse, bears, and extinct deer, also certain birds, turtles, larvae, and insects, as well as some plants, fruits, and seeds, while using boulders, silex, chalcedony, andesite, quartz, obsidian, bone, and perhaps wood to make utensils. These were generally coarse artifacts, such as scrapers, blades, flakes, and carved pebbles, executed with the so-called percussion techniques. The people of those times were dedicated to the preparation of skins, the carving of stone, bone, and perhaps wood, that is to say, to certain occupations that already implied the division of individuals by sex and age, by experience, and by efficiency in the work. Later, in the upper Paleoamerican period, 10,000 to 7,000 BC, man went from collecting to hunting large Pleistocene animals. In Tequisquiac Valley of Mexico, for example, numerous fossils of proboscides, bovines are the proboscides ancestors of the elephants, equids, right, the camels, all right, horses and camels, and a large number of artifacts have been exhumed, among which is a fossil llama sacrum, which was conveniently retouched to simulate the head of an animal, coyote or canine, which already indicates a certain aesthetic sense. Thanks to paleoethnological findings, we have a kind of photographs of the prehistoric world. In Santa Isabel, Ixtapan, Valley of Mexico, for example, the skeleton of a mammoth was discovered that was found in the lacustrine deposits of the upper Pleistocene, associated with 7 mythical artifacts. Among them, the foliated points used by hunters to kill it. From the town of Tepexpan, Valley of Mexico, comes the most dramatic painting of the hard life of these hunters, a human skeleton found in a flexed position, supposedly belonging to a hunter swallowed by quicksand during a hunting party, while in Chico, Valley of Mexico, a child's jawbone has been found next to the skull of an American horse. American horse. Other interesting finds have been carried out in the Tehuacan Valley, Huacan, Puebla, in the state of Jalisco, in the Tamaulipas Mountain, and in Hidalgo. According to the geographical location of the mentioned localities, we can say that now the groups of the upper Paleoamerican chose the open places to live, especially the edges of the lakes and plains, while some continued to occupy the caves. They predominantly hunted Pleistocene animals, including mammoths and deer, but also collected plants and plant products. Later, between 7000 and 5000 BC, at the beginning of the pre-ceramic period, 7000 to 2500 BC, these first settlers returned to mainly occupy the caves and rock shelters, motivated by the drier climatic conditions that transforming the large pastures into arid areas. It caused the disappearance of the large Pleistocene mammals, that is, the main source of food that had characterized the preceding period. A key moment of this period is the one that corresponds to the El Riego phase, 7200 and 5200 BC, in the Tehuacan Valley of Puebla. The people already had stones for grinding, metates, hands, scrapers, crushers, obsidian, blades, bone needles, and awls, spiked projectile points, deer antler and wooden darts, traps, nets, baskets, mats, and dart throwers. Atlan, the inhabitants of the place lived in caves, buried their dead inside them, and collected plants and products. Also in Tlapacoya and San Vicente, Chicoloapan, in the Valley of Mexico, similar objects have been brought to light. From the first locality in particular come the remains of wild teocintle. All right, this is where they get maize from, guys. Sea mexicana, a plant similar to wild corn, while in the second, a human skeleton has been found, dolichocephalic and with strong archaic features, associated with several curves with burned stones and arranged in circle. The findings from these localities and other similar ones indicate that these ancient settlers already collected several plant species, among which it is worth mentioning corn, pumpkin, and beans, trying to promote their growth. They still hunted the few Pleistocene animals that had survived and especially smaller animals. They took advantage of already known raw materials, along with new ones, such as plant fibers, agave, tule, and perhaps cotton and red cinnabar. Other daily activities were also carried out, such as the preparation of skins, weaving of fabrics, mats, nets, and baskets, carving all shells and seashells. This economy, without the fauna or the rhythm of the seasons and the habits of animals. Therefore, human groups had to lead a semi-nomadic existence. During the wet season, richer in plants and animals, they gathered in macro bands that lived in a single village. During the dry season, they divided up into microwaves that separated in search of other places to hunt and gather edible plants. The constant search and selection of edible plants made these groups begin to observe and later to know the growth rate of the plants. All right, we're talking about a real history of how people began agriculture. It didn't just start out of nowhere. So, from their observations, right, the growth rate of the plants and their capacity for reproduction, in other words, they were already on their way to gradually becoming farmers, that is, leading a sedentary life. In the late pre-ceramic period, 5000 to 2500 BC, some semi-sedentary communities emerged, which we call incipient agricultural communities. The archaeological investigations carried out in the Valley of Mexico, in the Tamaulipas Mountains, and in the Tehuacan Valley, Puebla, gave us an idea of what an incipient agricultural community had to be like around 5000 BC. Human groups began to cultivate a series of plants, thus moving from a parasitic economy to a food-producing economy. Although at first agriculture was incipient and had to be completed with hunting, fishing, and gathering, depending on the chosen habitat. Corn, or sea maíz, common bean, Phaseolus vulgaris, tepari bean, beans or fairies, 3 species of pumpkin, the chili, in addition to products of hunting, fishing, marine, lake or terrestrial harvesting, provided other foods, while waste products such as bones, shells, skins, etc. provided important raw materials that, properly processed, were transformed into utensils or ornaments with wood. Life became more comfortable. With the invention of agriculture, the population began to increase. Now the first villages arise along the banks or banks of the rivers and in the valleys, and some semi-subterranean dwellings appear, as in the Tehuacan Valley. In these more, it becomes richer and more varied. Not only instruments are produced, but also increasingly sophisticated ornaments, which indicate how in the interior these societies began to delineate differentiated classes. All right, so again, because they had time to chill, they had agriculture now. They don't have to be out hunting and worrying on how to survive because they got abundance. That's when your arts come in. You start making instruments, you start building cities, schools, right, canals, and then there's different classes coming out of this. Local groups were supposedly composed of several families united by kingship, perhaps of patrilineal lineage, who maintained contacts with the outside world, partly through the barter of raw materials and products. Probably clan organization and shamanism already existed, as well as the cult of the gods of fertility and the plants of the afterlife. The dead were shrouded in blankets and mats tied with cords, deposited in holes dug inside the caves, both in a flexed position, like someone returning to the bosom of Mother Earth, or extended like someone who fell asleep in the life of the world, visible. Furthermore, the deceased were sprinkled with red powder, cinnabar, all right, red ochre, red paint people, red powder cinnabar, and accompanied by poor funeral offerings. Later in the lower pre-classic period, 2500 to 1300 BC, the birth of the communities of agricultural villages is observed in many regions of the Mexican territory. Human groups already established in the sedentary and self-sufficient villages register a notable increase in population, averred by the great development of agriculture, which, by producing greater quantities of food, allows a greater number of individuals to be satisfied. Along with life in villages, social and religious aspects appear, such as magic or totemism, exogamous marriages, the taboo toward incest, purity, and fertility rites, or those linked to the cult of water or the earth, and finally, the most advanced funeral practices. Other characteristics of this period are, in addition, the appearance of ceramics and the increase in exchanges between the different regions of Mexico. All these elements mark the beginning of a more advanced, all right, listen to this, more advanced and complex social cultural phase than that of the African villages. All right, I remember I translated this, so I missed that part. That's what it's saying. More complex, more advanced than the so-called African villages. I didn't say it, and that's supposed to be the motherland over there, during which the culture of the Olmecs was formed and the foundations of the future civilizations of Mesoamerica were laid.
The setting, a hot lowland region of dense tropical jungles and swamps, with an annual rainfall of about 120 inches. The one main dry season, during which any substantial outdoor work is possible, begins in late February and ends in May, lasting only 100 days or so. A small Indian group living until recently on the island supported itself by the slash and burn method of farming maize. This involves cutting the forest, drying and burning the cut vegetation, and planting over the burnt field. Climatic and geological evidence indicate that the ancients also subsisted by this agricultural system. Studies show that the island cannot sustain more than 150 persons. Since an estimated 1.25 million man-days were required to build La Venta, the laborers must have come from elsewhere, probably the hilly area just west of La Venta. In theocratic government, common among early agricultural societies, the priesthood promised favorable weather and abundant crops in return for the manpower necessary to construct ceremonial centers. La Venta was almost certainly built under such an agreement. A lapse in the priesthood's success at weather control may have accounted for the abandonment of the site. La Venta's relative inaccessibility, probably considered an asset by the Olmecs, was the first problem encountered by modern parties. Clearing and burning revealed that the site extended for over half a mile along the island's low central ridge. On the surface, it consisted merely of a linear complex of clay mounds with a north-south orientation. At the south end was a great pyramid. To the north of the pyramid lay the main part of the site, composed of a central mound, a rectangular court, a large northern platform mound, a number of smaller mounds. La Venta was built in 4 distinct phases, a major construction effort occurring about every 100 years. In Phase 1, the pyramid and the 2 central mounds were erected. The court embankment was built, and the 3 platforms within the court were constructed. The earliest sandy clay floors were laid. In Phase 2, some existing structures were enlarged. The court's embankment was heightened by a yellow adobe brickwork wall, and the southern platforms were built. This period was marked by white sandy floor surfacings in the court. Phase 3 saw the enlargement of most structures and was characterized by floorings made of rose-pink sandy clays. In Phase 4, the flanker mounds were constructed. Then a final layer of red clay was deposited over the court floor and all structures. Basalt columns were set upright around the court, as well as around its 2 southern platforms. This was the last major alteration before the abandonment of the site. La Venta was laid out with a mathematical symmetry and authority. A line drawn from the center of the pyramid to the center of the northern mound bisects the main structures, leaving the pairs of secondary mounds equidistant on either side of this center line. The alignment, which bears 8 degrees west of true north, is believed to have been astronomically determined and of ritual significance to the builders. These, then, were the main surface features of the site: low clay platform mounds and basalt columns. Most of the La Venta treasures, even in the first millennium BC, lay below ground. Over 2,000 years later, though jungle and drift sand had erased almost every trace of the site, these treasures began to come to light. A trench dug from the foot of the pyramid through the heart of the northern mound showed that the center line indeed must have had some magical significance in Olmec religion, for precisely along it lay many of La Venta's most impressive and mystifying finds. Among the first encountered were several tombs, presumed to be the burial places of priests. The most imposing of these was fashioned of basalt columns atop the northern mound. Here was early evidence of the value which the Olmecs placed upon jade. This structure contained vestiges of 2 burials, each accompanied by a cache of precious jade objects similar to those found in the other tombs. The jade was skillfully fashioned into celts, figurines, beads, ear spools. The work, as well as the precious material, a salute to the departed dignitary. La Venta's tombs all dated from the 4th or latest construction phase, suggesting a build-up in ritual activity over the centuries, and perhaps an increase in the prestige of the priesthood. Not only the tombs had been placed so accurately along La Venta's center line, but also monuments and offerings of the 3 earlier periods. Here, a magnificent stone sculpture was found, the so-called Ambassador Monument. What may be early forms of calendrical glyphs or picture writing occur on this sculpture. On the left, a footprint. On the right, an oval design, a cloverleaf, a bird. Directly beneath the Ambassador Monument, and put down at the same time, lay 20 large imitation axes made of green serpentine, another favorite material of the Olmecs. Slightly to the north, a second cache appeared, consisting of 56 jade and green serpentine axe blades.
All right, so we're back in the book I translated, The Olmec, Mother Culture of Mesoamerica. And we move on to chapter 2. It says here, studies on the ancient Olmecs. I remember, these are the ones being called Olmec, the real ancient ones. At the beginning of the colonial period, 16th century AD, some missionaries and chroniclers, such as Sahagún, Torquemada, Muñoz, Camargo, and Alva Ixtlilxochtli, collected and transmitted information about the Olmecs from historical traditions. But the knowledge of the culture that we here call ancient Olmec, it began practically back in 1869, when Melgar published an article titled Mexican Antiquities, Notable Ancient Sculpture. In that article, Jose Melgar says, I was in 1862 living in San Andres Tuxtla, a town in the state of Veracruz in Mexico, and in some excursions I made, I learned of a colossal head that had been unearthed a few years before in one of the excursions I made, looking for antiquities. I arrived at the aforementioned hacienda and begged the owner of it to take me to see it. We went, and I was surprised. As a work of art, it is without exaggeration of a magnificent sculpture. But what impressed me most was the Ethiopian type it represents. All right, he's saying it looks like a so-called Negro. I reflected that there had undoubtedly been blacks, so-called blacks, in this country, and this was in the early days of the world. In the early days of the world, okay, there was what so-called blacks in Mexico. The head was not only important for Mexican archaeology, but also for that of the world in general, because it evidenced a fact of enormous consequences, okay? And this is what the guy said in 1862, Jose Melgar. All other scholars of that time, among them Alfredo Shaver, defended the thesis of the existence of a black physico-chemical type in the ancient populations of the New World, guys, all right? And they weren't Africans, and in particular of the Gulf Coast region of Veracruz and Tabasco, based on in the evidence provided by those colossal heads and by the anthropomorphic hard stone axes found in Veracruz and Guatemala. Okay, guys? Many scholars, we've already gone over this, right? My video I did recently for you guys, I translated 3 books from Mexico telling you the same thing, different people, all right? And he's letting you know many scholars have also determined this. In 1892, Paso y Troncoso, baptized with the term Olmec type, some figurines from Morelos and Guerrero, while Seville described a votive axe of jadate from Mexico, which is none other than the Kunz axe, so called by its discoverer, but noting that it represented a jaguar mask within an unknown and distinct artistic style. In 1907, Holmes wrote about a nephrite statuette from San Andres Tuxtla, Veracruz, which had been found by a farmer from that place in 1902, a statuette that represented a man with a duck mask and had engraved on its sides a Mayan hieroglyphic inscription with a date corresponding to 162 AD. Thanks to this discovery today known as the Tuxtla statuette, the hypothesis was defined that the new culture had had contacts with the Mayan culture. Meanwhile, new discoveries continued both in Guatemala and on the Gulf Coast. Bloom and Lafarge, among others, published in 1926-1927 Tribes and Temples, a work in which they reported on another colossal head found in Tres Zapotes and a magnificent sculpture found in San Martin, Payapan, which had a face with oblique eyes, a small, wide nose, a mouth curved downwards with a wide open upper lip, as well as data about La Venta, Tabasco, a place in which the Los Tuxtlas region, although other features are under the influence of the Mayan culture. These sensational discoveries further confirm the existence of an Olmec culture, right, in parentheses, since the sculptures found could not be attributed to any of the cultures known at that time. It was there that the Olmec culture began to be characterized by a series of elements belonging above all to the art of sculpture. So this is how they were categorizing what's Olmec and what's not, through the art. In 1929, Seville published an article, Through the Art. In 1929, Seville published an article in which he compared different votive axes, defining a series of features that characterize the Olmec. Among them, human body with feline-like head, jaguar mask, cleft head, slanted eyes, prominent canines, projecting upper lips, and small feline noses. Seville also pointed out that these works belong to the ancient Olmec culture, all right, not the new one, which apparently had its center in the area of San Andres Tuxtla, around Lake Catemaco, and extended to the coast of the Gulf of Mexico and the southern part of the state of Veracruz. The term Olmec culture, which appeared for the first time in 1929, reappears in the successive contributions of other researchers. In 1932, Valiant published an article titled A Pre-Columbian Jade, in which he mentioned almost the same Olmec features as Seville, although he was the first to point out that the figures with the face of a jaguar and those with the face of a child belong to the same artistic style, that this style does not correspond to that of the Aztecs, Toltecs, Zapotecs, Totonacos, and Mayans, that is, to the other Mesoamerican cultures of the classic and post-classic periods, that the historical Olmecs who dispersed through the South Veracruz, these are the invading ones, were famous for their work in jade and turquoise, and that the geographical position of these people approximately coincided with the distribution of the sculptures of jaguar faces and children's faces. Valiant himself pointed out in another 1934 article the intrusion of Olmec objects in materials from Guadalupita, Morelos, using the term to distinguish that new and special culture. Important archaeological discoveries are due to Eulalia Guzman, who in 1934 found some significant stone sculptures in Xalcatzingo, Morelos, as well as to Sterling, who in 1939 found in Tres Zapotes, Veracruz, the so-called Stela C, which on one of its sides bears the stylized face of a jaguar, and on another a date and numeral dots and bars, in the Mayan way, corresponding to the year 31 BC. Finally, in 1942, the Mexican Society of Anthropology organized a roundtable on problems of the Mayans and Olmecs, in which researchers such as Caso, Covarrubias, Jimenez Moreno, Kirchhoff, Sterling, Lyons, and others participated. In fact, in that roundtable, an attempt was made to update the knowledge that was available at that time about this new Olmec culture. The chronology was discussed, since according to North American archaeologists, the Olmec culture should be located in the Classic period, while for the Mexicans it was much older. In addition, the artistic style, its characteristics, extension, and relationship were analyzed, addressing issues relating to the historical Olmecs. Caso stated that the Olmec culture is of great finesse, which involves centuries of preparation or training, and which essentially influences later cultures. He also assured that this culture was not primitive at all, and was without a doubt the mother of other cultures such as the Mayan, the Teotihuacan, the Zapotec, the Tan, and others. Kirchhoff pointed out that some cultural features of the historical Olmecs were of great antiquity, among them the nose ring, the tattoo, the beard, etc. All right, beard, antiquity, which already appeared in the oldest archaeological remains of the land of rubber. It was already there. There was already nose rings, tattoos, beards, all that. Covarrubias included in the definition of the Olmec style small sculptures and semi-precious stones and monumental carvings, the jaguar as a basic motive. human beings with jaguaresque mouths, rock reliefs, colossal heads, monolithic altars, stone boxes, etc. He also said that the artistic style was connected distantly but evidently with the oldest Teotihuacan art, with the style called Totonaco, with the oldest forms of Mayan art, and with Zapotec objects, which the older they were tended to be more Olmec. So this culture could well be considered the mother of those mentioned and the most important, if not the only one, in the development of civilization in Mesoamerica. To avoid confusion with the historical Olmecs, all right, remember there's two different types of Olmecs. There's one that came in 1150. All right, so to avoid confusion with these historical Olmecs, that's what he's been calling them. At that meeting, it was proposed that the archaeological Olmec be designated with the name of La Venta culture. All right, they didn't call them Olmec. They say let's just call them La Venta culture, since it is the site known at the time. All right, so that's the old. This is old people. Jimenez Moreno proposed names such as Paleo Olmec, Pre Olmec, Proto Olmec. He's still calling them Olmec, etc., and even received the name of the Tinocelomec culture or the jaguar mouse. However, none of these designations were accepted, since the term Olmec had taken root, and today that culture is still called Olmec. All right, so hey, it was nothing they can do. People already were calling them Olmec, or its creators are also called archaeological Olmecs. All right, so again, all these terms and tags that these people that are being called Olmec never called themselves. At the round table of 42, some of the known features of the ancient Olmecs had therefore been summarized, although little was still known about pottery, religion, or Olmec society, since the main topic discussed until then it had been fundamentally sculpture. In any case, the round table gave a great boost to the knowledge of other aspects of this culture, made evident by the numerous archaeological investigations that were carried out in the Valley of Mexico, in Morelos, in Guerrero, in Oaxaca, in Chiapas, in Veracruz, Tabasco, and in the Guatemalan plateaus and Antilles. Thus, in addition to sculpture, the stratigraphy of some places on the coast became known, so that the Olmec culture began to be placed any time prior to the Classic period. Furthermore, the excavations carried out in Tlatilco, in the Valley of Mexico, highlighted the intrusion of Olmec materials in this place, as had already been observed in Gualupita, Morelos. The fact that these localities date back to the pre-classic or formative period allowed the Olmec culture to be placed in the middle pre-classic, that is, around 1000 BC. At the same time, new Olmec elements could be defined, such as the ritual game of ball, all right, ball games, the use of deformed and shaved heads, masks, and pyrite mirrors, as well as the appearance of various types of ceramics and decorative techniques, that is, the symbolism of his pottery in relation to the jaguar began to be clarified, based on a hollow terracotta figurine from Atlihuayang, Morelos. From there, new discoveries and studies on the Olmec were correlated with the pre-classic or formative period of Mesoamerica. Currently, we have a greater knowledge of the Olmec culture, and there is a general consensus of studies about some of its aspects. Despite this, there are still dark points and discrepancies among researchers, especially when it comes to the origin, evolution, phases of development, chronology, artistic style, and social structure of the Olmecs. Therefore, the Olmec theme continues to be valid, and its clarification is also exciting. In this regard, it was previously considered that this culture had centered around the Tuxtla and Catemaco. Covarrubias believed that it had originated in the state of Guerrero, and that from there it had spread to Morelos, Puebla, and the Gulf Coast. I pointed out that the Olmec of the basin of Mexico came from an area that would be located at the confluence of the states of Morelos, Puebla, Guerrero, Drucker, Heiser, Sanders and others have considered that the Gulf Coast had been the center of the origin of this culture, and in fact, there are other ideas regarding this problem. There are also researchers who think of an Olmec empire established by conquest, all right, Tasso, Coe, etc., or others who speak of commercial colonization, Jimenez Moreno, growth, etc. And there are those who mention Olmecoids and metropolitan areas of dispersion, Bernal. All of this shows that the problem of the ancient Olmecs has not been exhausted and that it is possible to restudy it. This is what we're doing, guys. We're restudying it. We're not just generalizing anymore. So we are to restudy it from the point of view of new approaches, all right, with all the new knowledge we got, other methods, and of course, in the light of the new evidence and ideas that we have today, okay? Because now we know America's the true old world. All right, and that's the end of chapter 2.
A third centerline offering was of particular interest. 38 jade and serpentine celts were found arranged in a cruciform pattern. Beneath them lay something absolutely unique. At the bottom of a pit, dug to a depth of 13 feet, had been placed 6 layers of serpentine blocks, each carefully smoothed and shaped into rectangular form. Although the layers gave the effect of pavements, they apparently were not intended to be walked upon or even seen. All evidence indicates that they were covered up immediately after being deposited. The serpentine layers and the cruciform jade offering were laid down at the beginning of construction phase 3. The pavement itself, as determined by trenching and testing with a soil auger, was nearly 65 feet square. The digging of the pit and the transport of the stone must have involved an effort verging on the superhuman. Yet this was only one of 5 such buried pavements found at La Venta. Also along the center line below the great tomb was another jade offering in the form of a cross. Directly to the north, a pair of identical offerings lay just 9 feet apart, equidistant from the center line. Each consisted of 9 jade celts and a concave mirror. Made of metallic ores of iron and titanium, the mirrors were distinctively Olmec. They remained without parallel anywhere in the world until the relatively late advent of concave lens grinding in Europe. 16 feet below these small offerings lay another of the mysterious serpentine pavements, this one dating from construction phase 4. The buried pavements have been interpreted as massive offerings. At least one, invariably topped by a cruciform jade offering, was put down at the beginning of each construction phase, possibly in a ceremony equivalent to the laying of a modern cornerstone. The wealth within the great northern mound may be explained by its close relationship with the ceremonial court. Here in the central plaza, the most important ritual activities of La Venta are presumed to have taken place. Barely protruding above the surface before excavation were some of the basalt columns which enclosed the court. Its dimensions were estimated at 135 by 188 feet. The columns had been added in the last building phase, perhaps as decoration, but more probably for privacy. The thick court floors, renewed each century, were by then nearly as high as the top of the Phase 2 encircling wall. Here, we assume, the priests performed sacred rites guaranteeing agricultural fertility, which resulted in economic security for the outlying population. Some of these rituals are portrayed in the stone sculpture of La Venta. Others are suggested by the architectural design. An entryway into the court at its northeast corner offers support for this conjecture. Through it may have come ceremonial processions, or sacrificial victims, or outlying maize farmers bringing tribute for the touchy gods of fertility. Dramatic evidence of one such rite came to light on the western edge of the northeast platform. As the court floor was being excavated toward the center line, a group of figurines and celts made an unexpected appearance. From earliest exposure, it could be seen that they were arranged in a deliberate pattern. Carefully cleared of ancient sand, the heads displayed typical Olmec facial representation: thick lips, slanting eyes, deformed skulls. At last the group stood fully revealed: 6 jade celts and 16 figurines, 13 made of serpentine, 2 of jade, and 1 of granite. This one is backed against a row of celts, which might be construed as a miniature palisade. Before him pass a file of 4, facing in the direction of a very haughty, authoritative figure. The remaining figurines, arranged in a semicircle, appear to be watching the scene. An important ceremony is obviously taking place. The haughty person seems to be the central character. Is he priest or visiting dignitary? The lone granite figurine may be a special personage, such as a captain. The file of 4 advancing toward the central figure could be acolytes, or dancers, or sacrificial victims. Their human counterparts may have been escorted into the court through the northeast entryway. Interpretation of the surrounding strata revealed a curious fact. About 100 years after the figurines were buried, a hole was cut through the court floors exactly to the level of their heads. Someone who knew precisely where to find the group evidently looked in, then simply refilled the hole. What records were kept at Levanta, so that long after the burial of an offering, it could be unerringly located? Levanta's most challenging structures were the court's 2 southern platforms. 1943 explorations in the southeast platform yielded an enormous mosaic mask representing the face of a jaguar, the favorite Olmec deity. In 1955, the final expedition set out to make a full-scale study of the southwest platform. Its position was marked by a 19 by 23-foot rectangle of basalt columns, some broken, some out of position, others missing. Like the columns of the court, they were associated with the last, or red clay cap, period. Excavation necessitated the removal of the columns, many weighing over 1 ton. A modern block and tackle was tried, shortly to be discarded in favor of rope slings and poles with human bearers. Also associated with Phase 4 were stone facing blocks, which occurred on all sides of the platform. They were laid in varying patterns, presumably as decoration. The platform itself consisted of unfired yellow adobe bricks laid in red clay mortar. The outlines of a small exploratory test pit dug in 1942 were still visible. At the Phase 3 level, another series of facing blocks was exposed. Upon the stratigraphic control wall, the layers of fills and floors made their appearance. The 16th and final layer of adobe bricks rested at the level of the white sandy floors of Phase 2. A massive fill of pink clay was next encountered. 5 feet below the top of this fill, some dressed serpentine blocks began to emerge. It soon became apparent, as mouth, eyes, and headdress plumes appeared, that another mosaic representation of a jaguar was being uncovered. The control wall was now removed, and the jaguar mask lay fully exposed, for the first time in over 2,000 years. It consisted of 485 carefully cut and smoothed serpentine blocks, an almost exact duplicate of the one found 12 years earlier in the twin platform to the east. Typically, the creators had worked on a large scale, covering an area of 15 by 20 feet. They had incorporated most of the conventional features found in other Olmec representations of the jaguar. The headdress is made up of 4 feathered plumes, the centers of the appendages filled with yellow clay. 4 eyes are depicted, rather than the 2 eyes commonly found in Olmec portrayals of the jaguar. The eyebrows are plumed in the customary style. The nose is a narrow vertical panel. The mouth agape and filled with cinnamon-colored sand. In its day, before the millennia had obscured the color and polish of the serpentine, the mask must have been one of the most splendid offerings ever laid down at La Venta. With its twin in the southeast platform, it launched the Phase 2 construction period. This second mosaic was indeed an exciting discovery. The reasons for its form, size, and deep burial still remain a mystery. But the mask was not all that the southwest platform held in store. Continued excavation revealed a layer of rough serpentine stones embedded in blue clay. While this development was being explored, the mask was carefully diagrammed. The stones were numbered and taken up, later to be reassembled at a museum.
All right, so we're going to go to this book now. And this is from the Reader's Digest, Mysteries of the Ancient Americas, the New World, before Columbus, before Salvador Sarco. Now we're going to read one of their chapters on the Olmec. And we go to page 130. And this chapter is called The Olmec Enigma. It says here, in the 1920s, archaeologists began to refer to a previously unknown Mexican civilization as Olmec. All right, it started in the 20s, and it didn't get popular until the 40s when the Smithsonian started, spreading it all over the states. So it was an unknown Mexican civilization. It says the Olmec, a term derived from the Aztec meaning dweller in the land of rubber. We will never know the real name of these innovative people. You hear what it's saying here? So again, Olmec is not their name. And now we know why. As again, in the last book we just read, the Olmec were really an invading tribe that came in 1150. That was not the name of the ancient people of Mexico. Now, whether we will know the real name, maybe we will. Maybe we will one day. And it says here, the best way to experience the brilliance of the ancient Olmec civilization, which began to unfold around 1200 BC along the Gulf Coast of southern Mexico, and which some 900 years later came to an inexplicable end. All right, remember, this is part of the hijack, is to study the remarkable art these dynamic people left behind them. Again, just like in the other book, art. This whole time, they've been basing the culture and history of the so-called ancient Olmec on the art, the sculptures, the artifacts, the stonework they have found, the pottery, the jade work. They've been basing their whole history on the art. Indeed, Olmec art furnished the earliest intimations that a forgotten civilization lay buried in southern Mexico. Since it first came to light in the middle of the 19th century, Olmec art has exerted an unusual fascination over those who have studied it. I have been struck, observed Matthew W. Sterling, the pioneer Olmec archaeologist. Now let's not forget who he is. Matthew William Sterling, an American ethnologist, right, was director of the Smithsonian Institute. He's the one that started dubbing the ancient people of Mexico Olmec. But he never went to excavate none of these places. He just took pictures beside these places, and the Mexican archaeologists were the ones doing all the work. They weren't calling the people Olmec. That was him and some others. So again, back in the book, Matthew W. Sterling, they're quoting him, right? So now we know this is their circle of friends, the authors of this Reader's Digest. They're calling him a pioneer Olmec archaeologist. By the number of individuals who, after becoming involved with a single fine specimen of Olmec art, spent the rest of their careers as Olmec enthusiasts. What was true of others was also true of Sterling. In 1918, while still a student in California, all right, before he became the director of the Smithsonian Institute, he came across a photograph of a jade mask that so intrigued him that 2 years later he made a trip to Germany to see the original. The bait that hooked me into a career of Olmec research, explained Sterling, was a small blue jade mask in the Berlin Museum. Beginning in 1938 and for the rest of his life, Sterling explored and interpreted the ancient civilization of the Olmec. His achievements in opening the door to the splendors of the Olmec world are comparable to the contributions made by Heinrich Schliemann in discovering Troy, gosh the hijack, and by Arthur Evans in reconstructing an ancient Knossos. Unlike other great pre-Columbian cultures, the Olmec was unknown to the conquistadors. When Sterling began his researches, there was even great doubt whether an Olmec civilization had ever existed. It was the Maya who were looked upon as the great civilizers in Mesoamerica. Yet the mask, statuettes, figurine of jade, and serpentine relinquished by the jungles in Veracruz and Tabasco, in southern Mexico, which gradually found their way into the hands of art collectors and museum curators, gave rise to numerous theories and speculations. Olmec art did not fit into any culture then known. All right, it didn't look like the other art and the other cultures. Had there been another civilization in Mesoamerica? A vanished people? Some of the most mysterious and exciting sculptures of Middle America, wrote the Mexican artist Miguel Covarrubias, certainly belonging among the masterpieces of world art, lie scattered in the jungle and swamps of the southern Gulf Coast. Its aesthetic ideology and the spirit of the early cultures, simplicity and sensual realism of form, vigorous and original conceptions. Okay, so we're going to look at a serpentine figurine bearing traces of cinnabar, maybe a real-life portrait of an Olmec ruler, a real-life portrait. So if this one's a real-life portrait, then a lot of them might be, right? Two faint lines on his right cheek, now barely visible, even under close scrutiny, give him the name, the Lord of the Double Scroll. So let's go see what they're talking about. And this is the piece right here. And they're telling you this represented a real person. There's a different phenotype, see? But could still be melanated. Let's not look at any of these figures with stereotypes. But they're showing you the art, the beauty, letting you know this was a portrait of a real ruler. Continuing, perhaps the most intriguing and exotic of all the objects that led at last to the discovery of the Olmec were the huge stone heads, unearthed in the states of Veracruz and Tabasco. In 1862, a farmer in Veracruz stumbled on the first of the gigantic heads, which he mistook at first for an overturned kettle because of its smooth surface. Disappointed that it was not a treasure trove, he explored no further. Some years later, the head came to the attention of a Mexican archaeologist, Jose Melgari Serrano, who in 1869 reported on it in a scientific journal as the first published account of any Olmec find from that area of Mexico. This was a landmark step, although the conclusions Melgar drew were questionable. As a work of art, he wrote, "It is without exaggeration a magnificent sculpture. But what astonished me was the Ethiopic type represented," all right? Same thing we just read. "I reflect that there had undoubtedly been Negroes in this country." All right? Again, just in case people weren't clear. Melgar's report stirred little interest at the time. However, the discovery of a second similar head several decades later began to focus archaeological attention on this neglected area of Mexico. In 1925, Franz Blum, a Danish-born scientist, and Oliver Lafarge, an American writer, set out on an exploration of Mexico, which took them to La Venta in Tabasco. There, at a vast overgrown ceremonial center, they came upon the most amazing monument of them all, a huge bell-shaped boulder. At first, it puzzled us very much, but after a little digging, to our amazement, we saw that what we had in front of us was the upper part of a colossal head, tracing Olmec roots. So let's see what they're saying, right? The guy from Smithsonian. In 1938, Matthew Sterling embarked on his first exploration of southern Mexico. Remember, he didn't do none of these archaeological digs. He just went there and took pictures. The Mexican local anthropologist did all the work, which was then still archaeology. Relatively uncharted country, a hinterland, he called it. It was a land laced by meandering, sluggish rivers. The most important one, the Coatzacoalcos, with its many tributaries, and lagoons bordered by mangrove forests. Small settlements of Indian farmers were scattered here and there, usually connected by water transportation. The air was hot and humid, and the annual rainfall sometimes reached 100 inches, with the exception of the Tuxtla Mountains, averaging only 1,600 feet in altitude. This was a lowland, coastal landscape whose river levees were flooded each year to a depth of 21 feet. That the first great pre-Columbian society should have arisen in this seemingly inhospitable environment is perplexing. But as the anthropologist and Olmec scholar Michael Coe pointed out in 1981, Olmec civilization, like that of Egypt, is the gift of the river. Both the Nile and the many rivers of the southern Mexico leave behind a deep, rich soil after each year's flooding, conferring an invaluable asset on an agricultural people. Here was land that did not have to be cleared before planting and then left to lie fallow after 2 seasons' use. All right? Do you guys understand? When we're talking about fertile land or a rich black soil, that's what Kemet means. When it referencing the Nile, right, overflowing, what Nile means the great river. Well, the Mississippi does the same thing. The Mississippi Delta is very fertile. And so that's what they're talking about, rich black soil or Kemet. Because that's the etymology of Kemet, rich black soil. What had appeared at first glance to be an environment hostile to settlement and the growth of a stable society was shown, on examination, to be as if ordained by nature to become a cradle of civilization. Gradually beginning in the 1940s, all right, in the 1940s, this is when it gets really popular. The legacy of the Olmec civilization and its achievements have emerged. So before the 40s, guys, there was no such thing as so-called Olmec. Within a 6,000 to 7,000 square mile area, smaller than the state of Vermont, there are at least 4 major ceremonial centers that have been excavated, uncounted smaller ones, and hundreds of earthen mounds have yet to be explored. Archaeologically, the Olmec heartland, as this area has come to be called, is still barely touched. The 4 major sites that have been explored are San Lorenzo, the earliest center with dates ranging from 1200 to around 900 BC, Laguna de los Cerros, and La Venta, which both date from around 1000 to 600 BC, and Tres Zapotes, a transitional site with imprecise dating. Tres Zapotes bridges the time between the end of the Olmec civilization, dodge the hijack, remember, the real end, the only time that any mass extinction or people ending, or anybody that had to relocate or move out of there during that cataclysm that we read about in 800s AD. Before then, the so-called Olmec, that's not what they call themselves, just kept evolving to different cultures. So-called Maya, right? Let's not forget there's people migrating into this area as well, mixing, from the legends of the Maya and the Mexica people coming from the north. The so-called Olmec culture was already there. You can't just say they went extinct. These people eventually started mixing with each other, creating the whole Maya culture and the Veracruz culture which followed. In the early 1940s, when Matthew Sterling first published the results of his excavations at Tres Zapotes, and at La Venta, where he had found works of art ranging from the huge stone monuments to fragile clay images. He called forth one of the most savagely unforgiving debates in all archaeological history. The mysterious producers of this class of art, reported Sterling, have been called the Olmecs. All right, he's the one that made that word go viral. A people whose origin is as yet very little known. They don't know anything about them, guys. But look, he just said he's giving them a name, but he don't know anything about them. A people whose origin is as yet very little known. They don't know. Present archaeological evidence indicates that their culture, which in many respects reached a high level, is very early and may well be the basic civilization out of which developed such high art centers as those of the Maya. On one side, the Mayanists were convinced that all Mesoamerican civilizations originated with the Maya. Remember, it's the same people that were still in the same area, and the calendars prove it. The Olmec calendar, Maya calendar, it's just a continuation. They attacked Sterling's theory and denied the very existence of ancient Olmec, or would at most concede that they were a late and decadent branch of the Maya. Arguing against them were Mexican archaeologists such as Alfonso Caso, who had reconstructed the ruins of Monte Alban, and Miguel Covarrubias, joined by a small band of American scholars. The fact that some pieces had been found, a stele known as Stel C in Tres Zapotes, and a small jade statuette in the shape of a duck with hieroglyphic writing, and a date that preceded Maya civilization was dismissed by the Mayanists. The date and glyphs might have been carved later, ran the argument, not until the mid-1950s when radiocarbon dating of La Venta artifacts provided irrefutable proof of Olmec antiquity and importance was the existence of their civilization widely accepted. Again, we got to go with their carbon datings. Recognition as the mother culture of Mesoamerica came late to the Olmec. All right, so-called Olmec. That's not their name. Of all the Olmec ceremonial centers, none exceeds La Venta in impressiveness. It has been called the glory of the ancient Olmec. It stands on an isolated, sandy island, 2 miles square, which rises some 40 feet above the surrounding swampland and the tidal Tonala River. The ceremonial precincts lie roughly in the center of the island and are made up of a sunken plaza and pyramids, including one whose shape is unique in all the New World. Rising some 103 feet above the rectangular site, it dominates the other structures and may have originally looked like a fluted volcanic cone. It was artificially built of 3.5 million cubic feet of clay. Some scholars have suggested that the people of La Venta sprang from the volcanic Tustala Mountains and that this pyramid commemorates their ancestral origins. Ooh, now that's a deep one. An origin to the shape of pyramids? Because people coming out of volcanoes or mountains, huh? That's not over there on that side of the world. Whatever the inspiration may have been, the pyramid exemplifies the sheer monumentality of Olmec construction and the unlimited man hours of backbreaking labor that went into it. What is true of their building is equally true of their sculpture. The large pieces are characterized by an imposing massiveness. At La Venta, Sterling found 4 colossal heads, each weighing as much as 20 tons, and a giant stele that weighed 50 tons and stood 14 feet tall. 7 altars, one of which measured 11.5 feet in length and more than 5 feet in height, were also unearthed. Rectangular in shape and carved with figures and scenes, these stupendous blocks of stone look like altars, but may actually have been thrones for Olmec rulers. So this is a stone head here, example they have in the book. This is exploring the site of Tres Zapotes in 1939. That's Michael Sterling, remember. He's the Smithsonian guy. He just went to take pictures next to these things, pretending he excavated it. He didn't do none of the work, all right? But again, here goes a colossal stone head from Tres Zapotes. And this is another one he found in La Venta, all right? Or they found, right? Not him. But this is the stone head in La Venta. So again, you guys all familiar with the giant stone heads, okay? Continuing, it says here, anthropologists agree that Olmec society was in fact authoritarian and highly stratified. It seems likely that the major centers were governed by dynasties with absolute power to enforce obedience and discipline. Like the Maya who followed them, the society below the rulers was divided into administrators, engineers, foremen, and straw bosses, with a large subservient peasantry at the base. The gifted sculptors and artists to whom we owe our awareness of this brilliant civilization probably constituted a social entity unto themselves. Philip Drucker, one of the excavators of La Venta, has theorized that as such society grows larger, the social structure becomes more rigid, especially in the area of class distinction. Ceremonialism becomes more complex and spectacular, drawing vast crowds of offering-laden pilgrims. Religion. How did such a society develop from the simple, egalitarian life of a small farming village? The probable explanation lies in the bounty of the soil in the Olmec heartland. Gradually, these rich lands along a river bank came into the possession of one family and their kin, giving them a margin of wealth denied to the other villagers. With wealth came power, that over generations could elevate one family to a position of overall authority. This social transformation, which began between 1300 and 1200 BC, before Olmec civilization came into being, led finally to the establishment of authoritarian rule. 3,000 years after the Olmec lived, their colossal heads gave us some idea of what these ancient rulers looked like. Among scholars, it is now almost universally accepted that the colossal heads, so far there are 13 in all, from 3 different sides, are portraits of actual rulers, real people. But there are few who still treasure theories that the colossal heads represent alien invaders. All right, now that also could be true, but not just like an invader, but it could be people, foreigners, ball players. I would say, and if you've seen my Ancient Sports of America videos, that these are like famous ball players. But there are a few again who still treasure theories that the colossal heads represent alien invaders, whether Africans, and that's only because of the phenotype. There's no proof of them being Africans. We've already debunked that, as Melgar believed, or Polynesians blown ashore on Mexico's west coast. Do Polynesians look like this? Yes, they did. You guys have seen my Black Asian videos, right? At first glance, all the heads resemble one another, but on closer examination, differences emerge. Some faces are rounder than others, some are jowlier, some noses are narrower, and the outlines of mouths vary. Every head wears a close-fitting helmet, again, helmet, with an insignia or adornment on the front. No two are alike, and they may represent dynastic glyphs, an equivalent of a royal coat of arms. Even today, the heads exert a sense of authority, power, and brute force. It would be a mistake to interpret Olmec civilization as based solely on physical strength. Evidence has come down over the centuries that suggests surprising technical skills. For example, it is possible that the Olmec at San Lorenzo were using a magnetic lodestone compass before 1000 BC, 1,000 years before the Chinese are credited with discovering it. In 1967, Cole found a magnet at San Lorenzo carved in the form of a grooved oblong bar. To test this supposition that it might be part of a compass, he cut a piece from a cork mat and floated it in water, with the compass on top. The bar consistently aligned itself slightly west of magnetic north. When the bar was turned over, the alignment was slightly east of magnetic north. Other, more sophisticated experiments conducted 6 years later indicated that the Olmec probably manufactured and used a simple compass. The Olmec were especially skillful in working in iron ores. All right, iron. Their most startling achievements were highly polished concave iron mirrors, which Olmec sculptures tells us were worn as pendants, probably by the elite to symbolize their power and authority. All right, so real quick, we got these stone carvings right here, sculptures. Says here 7 massive stone monuments were found at La Venta and have been called altars for their space. The quintuplet altar above left portrays a man cradling a half jaguar, half human child, a theme that is repeated 4 more times in bas relief above right on the sides of the altar. Whether these scenes have a religious or a dynastic meaning remains a mystery, right? So we're going to get a possible suggestion in the other book of what they mean, possibly. Continuing, remains of the mirrors have been found at La Venta and at San Lorenzo, but the technology used to achieve the high polish and the perfection of the curvature still amazes scientists. Studies under a microscope reveal no traces that abrasives were used, and yet, as one scholar put it, their polish is so extraordinary that it reaches the limit of possible perfection. All right? This is advanced civilization here in the true old world. Among their other talents, the Olmec were master engineers. Excavations at La Venta and San Lorenzo have turned up a complex drainage system, whose exact purpose is still unknown. At San Lorenzo, excavators have found a main drainage line measuring 558 feet, with subsidiary lines of 98 feet. The drains are made of 30 tons of basalt, all brought from the Tuxtla Mountains, more than 35 miles distant. Each block of stone was hollowed out and fitted with a stone cover. The whole main line runs at a gentle 2% grade from east to west. The man-made ponds that dot San Lorenzo were possibly connected to this system. Were these pools sacred and therefore worthy of such elaborate drainage? Could they have been part of a holy ritual for pilgrims? Many of the rites and rituals of the Olmec are lost in the past, but recent researches have disclosed that the pantheon of their gods was much more complex than was once thought. Olmec religion had at first seemed obvious to the archaeologists. Wherever they looked, they saw evidence that a cult of the jaguar pervaded the Olmec world. All right, this is something we're going to get into a lot. This so-called cult they're calling of the jaguar god. His image appeared on stone altars and steles. It was carved in jade and serpentine and painted on the rocky walls of caves. Half man, half beast, he was pictured with a snarling mouth, an upturned nose, flame-shaped eyebrows, and at times a receding lower jaw. At least 2 carvings and perhaps 3, which appear to depict a jaguar in sexual intercourse with a woman, have been interpreted by some archaeologists as portraying an Olmec origin myth. However, the latest research undertaken by David Joralmon shows that the Olmec worshipped 10 major gods. All right, dodge the hijack. See, they're saying worship, where they really worship. They don't know much about these people. All they have is the art. Remember, all they have is the art. A jaguar god among them, all of whom appear later in different guises throughout Mesoamerica. One of these gods who played a large role in the Aztec pantheon was the rain god, frequently represented as an infant by the Olmec. All right, the rain god represented as an infant. The association of a human infant with rain, Michael Cole writes, recalls the annual sacrifice of little children to the god Tlaloc among the Aztec. The tears of the hapless children called down the tears of the heavenly cumulus clouds.
Excavation was resumed, again with a control wall bisecting the mask area. Work to east and west of it exposed a continuous pavement of the rough serpentine stone. A second, third, and fourth layer were revealed and removed from the west side of the wall. Those in the eastern half were stepped down, so that portions of all 4 tiers were exposed in vertical relationship. As the layers continued downward, however, the eastern remnants were removed, and both sides stripped down through an eighth layer. Excavation was now confined to the western side of the wall, for the layers of uneven stone chunks went on and on, becoming progressively larger and more closely packed. At the 18th layer, the excavation was reduced to an 8 by 4 foot shaft. Ten more layers were laboriously cut through until a thick clay fill was encountered lying on the subsoil. Thus, the seemingly bottomless pit ended, nearly 18 feet below the jaguar mask, 31 feet below the top of the red clay cap, and 35 feet below the surface of the site as it was in 1955. The southwest platform is not only an example of superb engineering, but reflects the baffling religious psychology underlying its construction. At the beginning of Phase 2, an area of 50 by 61 feet was laid out and dug 23 feet deep. Where the steep sides of the pit cut through loose sand, the Olmec engineers built clay retaining walls to prevent caving. The bottom of the pit measured 41 by 49 feet. Upon it was placed a layer of rough green serpentine slabs, then a layer of clay, another layer of stones, and so on until 28 such layers had been put down. Capping the stone fill was a layer of clay, upon which had been placed the mosaic mask, enveloped in olive-colored clay. A 5-foot-thick layer of pink clay was then packed on top of the mask, and upon this was constructed the platform of adobe brickwork. In Phase 3, only minor alterations were made. During the Phase 4 period, not long before the abandonment of the site, the platform was enlarged. The final red clay capping was added, and the basalt columns were set in place. It has been estimated that about 100 men could have dug and filled the great pit in 80 days. 1,000 tons of serpentine slabs, over 100,000 cubic feet of clay were used to fill the pit. The serpentine had to be transported from the Pacific coast, 150 miles away. These figures reflect the enormous expenditure of human energy involved in only one of La Venta's structures. The beliefs which motivated this effort are lost in antiquity. Thus, the major part of the La Venta excavations was concluded. The huge pyramid, consisting of 5 million cubic feet of earth, remains largely unexcavated. Minor explorations in other mounds yielded little information. Beyond the main complex, some extraordinary stone monuments were found. Among them, the whale, and the so-called rattlesnake monument, on which the plumed serpent is featured. In all, some 40 pieces of stone sculpture were recovered. Over 5,000 tons of serpentine. Over 2,000 pieces of jade. La Venta, with its accumulated wealth of nearly 1,000 years, may be regarded as a national treasury, comparable to the great cathedrals of Europe. La Venta is now stripped of its monuments and jade. The symmetrical clay mounds have been destroyed by bulldozers. No further excavations are possible in the main part of the site. An oil refinery overlooks the area where ornately costumed priests once performed elaborate rituals. Essentially, the studies at La Venta show that high civilization flourished in Middle America about 1,000 years earlier than previously supposed. Throughout a 400-year period, A well-established theocracy created a ritual center in which religious beliefs were architecturally expressed. We do not know the forms of the ancient rituals. We cannot fathom the meaning of the buried pavements. Nor do we know why the site was abandoned at an apparent peak of development. The excavations, however, do offer us a glimpse into prehistory, when priest kings ruled at Levanta, when priest kings ruled at Levanta, when priest kings ruled at Levanta, and the populace toiled in honor of the awesome jaguar god.
All right, now we're going to get into this book. It's called The Mystery of the Olmecs by David Hatcher Childress. Now again, you ready to dodge the hijack? But we're going to pull out the jewels out of this one as well. We're going to get into a lot of books as we keep learning about the so-called Olmec. Again, the mystery of the Olmecs. So again, the famous picture of Michael Sterling and Tres Zapotes pretending that he actually excavated the thing. This is an excavation in San Lorenzo, Veracruz. All right, look at that. This is a picture of La Venta, Mexico in 1946. And it says here, Chapter 1, The Mystery of the Origin of the Olmecs. We can trace the progress of man in Mexico without noting any definite Old World influence during this period, 1650 BC, except a strong Negroid substratum connected with the magicians, high priest. And who said that? Frederick Peterson, Ancient Mexico, 1959. That's what he's saying. But you got to dodge the hijack because he just said that Negroid people were only found in the so-called Old World over there on that side, that there wasn't no so-called Negroid people here. So that's why I said be ready to dodge the hijack. It says here, the strange worlds of the Olmecs. The oldest and probably greatest mystery of early Mexico and North America in general is the problem of the Olmecs. Olmecs are now often referred to as Proto-Mayans by academic archaeologists, or Olmans, meaning inhabitants of Olman, the Olmec land, as it is now being called. When one looks at the enigmatic cave drawings, the gigantic, perfectly carved heads, the trademark frown, and the violent, militaristic look of the Olmecs, an emphatic question leaps to the forebrain. Who are these weirdos? Gosh, the hijack. The strange world of the Olmecs is only now being pieced together in their art. Again, through their art. You guys get it now? This is all they ever had. The art. This is what they're basing their whole history off. The art. Olmecs are often dressed in leather helmets. Leather helmets like the early football players have broad faces and thick lips, plus broad noses, have a mean-looking expression, and could easily be likened to a bunch of angry African rugby players. All right, dodge the hijack. They're not African, so this book is gonna kind of Africanize a little bit, guys. While mainstream archaeologists assure us that Africans never colonized Mexico or Central America, the average man looks at these statues and heads and wonders how academia can make such a blatantly wrong assertion. So again, this is so wrong the way they're saying it, right, guys? So just because you find people that have these type of phenotypes doesn't mean they're African. All right, dodge the hijack. But it's clear what the stone heads look like, right? What is fascinating about this enigmatic civilization to us modern viewers is how they represented themselves. Now listen to this, because this is the part everybody leaves out. In addition to these showing Negroid features, many artifacts depict individuals who have Oriental or European features, what they're calling, again, Oriental and European. Again, America's a true old world, guys. We had every phenotype here, but this is big. Nobody ever wants to talk about the Oriental looking so-called Olmecs. And we're talking about they're finding these artifacts in the same time period as the stone colossal heads, okay? So again, many individuals are also being depicted that look Oriental or what they're saying, have straight noses, European features. It is therefore very interesting to pay close attention to how the figures are presented, how they dressed, the headgear they wore, the shape of their eyes, nose, ears, and mouths, the way they held their hands, and the expressions of their faces. It is all wonderful art at its finest. Again, art. The expressions and symbolism in the objects they hold or are associated with seem to indicate a high level of sophistication and a shared iconography. What does it all mean? Who are these people? They don't know. Were they isolated villagers or strangers from a faraway land? The discovery of the Olmec. So again, they're going to go over the whole story. Until the 1930s, it was largely held that the oldest civilization in the Americas was that of the Maya. The great quantity of Mayan monuments, steles, pottery, statues, and other artifacts discovered throughout the Yucatan, Guatemala, and the Gulf Coast of Mexico had convinced archaeologists that the Maya were the mother civilization of Central America. But some Mayan artifacts were different from the main bulk of the artifacts in subtle ways. One difference was that some carvings of a large head had faces with more African-looking features than many of other Mayan works. Mayan paintings and sculptures can be quite varied, but the African-looking features seem distinctly un-Mayan. Now again, he's basing on what he thinks a modern Mayan looks like today. These African-looking heads starts to hijack. We had all the phenotypes. You mean the Negro-looking heads? Negro. See, he's adding African there, guys. This is what Van Sarama did. This is what many Pan-Africans did before me. So these Negro-looking heads often had a curious frown and often wore masks or appeared to be half jaguar, half man, beast. This recurrent motive did not fit in with other Mayan finds. In 1929, Marshall H. Saville, the director of the Museum of the American Indian in New York, classified these works as being from an entirely new culture not of Mayan heritage. Somewhat inappropriately, he called this culture Olmec, a name first assigned to it in 1927, which means rubber people in Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica or Aztec people. So this was a name given to them by who? Other people. Most of the early anomalous artifacts were found in the Tabasco and Veracruz regions of southern Mexico, a swampy region exploited for natural gas, but in ancient times a source point for rubber. Ancient Mesoamericans spawning from the Olmecs to Aztecs extracted latex from Castilla elastica, a type of rubber tree in the area. All right, so check out my Ancient Sports of America video, especially part 1. We go over the whole breakdown of rubber and rubber balls, who first had these, okay? The juice of Loval vine, Ipomoea alba, was then mixed with this latex to create rubber as early as 1600 BC and possibly earlier. All right, they were making rubber balls. Olmec was the Aztec name for the people who lived in this area at the much later time of Aztec dominance. Indeed, the Olmecs are now credited with creating the ball game that played such a significant role in all Mesoamerican civilizations, and the rubber balls that were used in the game, okay? Rubber balls was created here, and ballparks and ball games. Who dominates sports mainly? Come on now, you see the pattern? This game may be even older than the Olmecs. In fact, ball courts, listen to this, and the Olmec Mayan ball game were popular even as far north as Arizona and Utah, and as far south as Costa Rica and Panama. Yeah, pura vida land. According to the famous Mexican archaeologist Ignacio Bernal, Olmec type art was first noticed as early as 1869, but as noted above, the term Olmec or rubber people was first used in 1927. All right, before that, it didn't exist. Nobody knew that word. Naturally, a number of prominent Mayan archaeologists, including Eric Thompson, who helped decipher the Mayan calendar, refused to believe that this new culture called the Olmecs could be earlier than the Mayas. Not until a special meeting in Mexico City in 1942, all right, that was the round table we read about earlier, that included the director like Sterling of the Smithsonian Institute, where they convinced these Mexican archaeologists to use the word Olmec and to accept the Olmec theory. So on this date in Mexico City, 1942, was the matter largely settled that the Olmecs predated the Mayans, all right? But again, it was just the same people that eventually were also called Mayas. The Mayas were people coming from the north too. This is different people mixing together, creating different cultures. The date for the beginning of the Olmec culture was to remain a matter of great debate, however. Bernal sums up this curious archaeological episode in his book, A History of Mexican Archaeology. It seems barely credible today that, except for a few isolated mentions, Melgar, 1869, 1871, studies of small finds, Seville, 1902-1929, or travels such as those of Bloom and Lafarge in 1925, or Wehrstahl in 1937, what we now call the Olmec culture was totally unknown. Unknown, guys. They started making everything up after the 20s. It was, in fact, only in 1938 that the Smithsonian Institute and the National Geographic Society began work in the area. Do you guys understand? They're just now learning about the ancient Americas. By this time, they already had created their whole fake Egyptology. You see how that worked? When they hadn't even explored the Americas yet. And this was all done by under the enthusiastic leadership of Matthew Sterling. In a few years, they achieved the most sensational results by means of the exploration, albeit incomplete, of Tres Zapotes and La Venta, the extraordinary monoliths found in these cities and at other places in the area, to which Sterling was soon to add further equally marvelous finds from Cerro de las Mesas, a site which is not really Olmec though the finds to which I am referring are, caused a great stir in archaeological circles and threw up a whole series of problems of the highest importance for an understanding of the past. Perhaps the first of these problems was, to what date are we to assign this culture? Is it part of the horizon, then still being called the Archaic? Is it a forerunner of the Maya and other cultures, and thus the mother culture of Mesoamerica as a whole? Or are we dealing with a late local culture corresponding with the historic Olmec of the written sources? Each of these obviously related questions elicited a different answer. Nobody can agree, guys, they don't know. The somewhat skeptical position taken up by Eric Thompson, the greatest of the Mayanists, 1941, and many others with regard to the antiquity of the Olmecs was based mainly on his refusal to accept the very early dates ascribed to the stone inscriptions, as on Stela C at Tres Zapotes, and to the possibility that they might even antedate the Mayan calendar. And in fact, another of the basic changes in archaeological dating was the discovery that the Maya calendar is not strictly speaking Maya at all right, but wasn't used before the first inscriptions at Huaxactun were set up. The Maya therefore did not more than elaborate upon it, all right? So who they get it from, influenced by the so-called Olmec, is the same people, different cultures, different times. People evolve, right? Things change. Doesn't mean they all went extinct, though. The initial date inscribed on Stela C was much disputed, but there is now little doubt about it. Sterling's theory, formulated even before the discovery of the other half of the stela, is the correct one. This proved not only that he had been justified in thinking of the date as very early, in fact, it strikes us now as being, if anything, too recent, but that the whole Olmec culture is earlier than the Maya, all right? They just dropped one right there. They said, in fact, it might be too recent. It's probably older. They're saying in this book it's probably a lot older. It's too recent, actually, the date they're giving the Olmec, 1200 BC. Starts to hijack with the carbon datings. This was anathema at the time because, as we have already seen, almost all the endeavors of the Carnegie and other institutions, North American in particular, had been directed towards Maya research. The consensus of opinion then being not only that the Maya culture was the oldest, but that all the other Mesoamerican cultures had stemmed from it. At the celebrated meeting held under the aegis of the Sociedad Mexicana de Antropología in 1942 to discuss the Olmec problem, Archaeologists headed by Caso, Covarrubias, and Noguera, along with Sterling, all maintained that the Olmecs belonged within the archaic horizon. Caso claimed that the Olmec is beyond doubt the parent of such other cultures as the Maya, the Teotihuacan, and that of El Tajín. Covarrubias held that whereas other cultural complexes share Olmec traits, this style contains no vestiges or elements taken over from other cultures, unless it be from those known as archaic. Violent was one of the few North Americans to back up these theories, and he did so because, in the course of his fine work on the Central Plateau, with which we are already familiar, he had come across archaic figurines displaying undoubted kinship with Olmec types. Eric Thompson, on the other hand, thought that the Olmec was a late culture within what we have now come to call the post-classic. All right, that might be the other Olmec that came later, the barbarians, and they're confusing them, you see. And yet the name Olmec, first used by Bayer in 1927 to designate this particular art style. This is what he was calling the art style, not the people, has prevailed until today. Incorrect though it may be, it's incorrect. All right, it's incorrect. It is a source of confusion because it is lifted from historical sources which apply the term Olmec to very much later peoples. Much later peoples. Listen, this is the other tribe, the barbarians. In 1942, Jimenez Moreno cleared the matter up by showing that the name Olmec properly refers to the inhabitants of the natural rubber-grown areas. But even so, we have to distinguish clearly between the relatively recent bearers of the name, all right, the recent bearers of the name, and the archaeological Olmecs, okay? Now, even in this book, guys, as you can see, they're telling you there's two different types of Olmecs, and the ones from the ancient times never called themselves Olmec. So who are the real Olmecs? It was a barbarian invading tribe. So Moreno's telling you, but even so, we have to distinguish clearly between the relatively recent bearers of the name and the archaeological Olmecs, which is why he proposed that these be called the La Venta people. We just read that before, right? A lot of these Mexican anthropologists, they refuse to use the name Olmec because that's a modern people. To make confusion less confounded, right? But the name given at baptism was not to be shaken off, and is the one still used today. So we have been using this incorrect term for the ancient people of Mexico. Do you guys understand now? At the Mesa Redonda de Tuxtla in 1942, the Olmecs were given a provisional starting date around 300 BC, but somewhat later work at San Lorenzo, carried out with the aid of radiocarbon analysis, the use of which was spreading throughout the area, showed that 1200 BC was a more realistic date. All right, again, dodge the hijack with their carbon datings. This fitted in perfectly with what was being discovered all over Mesoamerica. It is a part of the general process that has already been discussed. 19th century scholars had often proposed fabulously early dates for the pre-Hispanic peoples, and it produced in this century a vigorous counter-reaction, which in its turn condensed them too drastically. But after 1950, this difficulty was to be overcome by the use of dating techniques that are not essentially archaeological. Many problems concerning the Olmec culture still remain unresolved, but its existence and its importance are now beyond question. Work at a number of sites outside the limited areas I have already mentioned aided serious discussion of Mesoamerican archaeology as a whole. Research focused mainly on architecture, sculpture, and pottery, without, as a rule, paying much attention to those sidelines that we might call ethnological. In spite of this, the results were remarkable, and by 1950 there was an immense amount of material awaiting study. The Olmecs had been discovered, so-called Olmecs. However, this discovery created more questions than there were answers. The discovery of the Olmecs seemed to cast into doubt many of the old assumptions concerning the prehistory of the Americas. Suddenly, here was a diverse-looking people who built monumental sculptures with amazing skill. Were the actual inventors of the number and writing system used by the Maya, the ball game with its rubber balls, and even knew about the wheel, as evidenced by their wheeled toys. Okay? The greater enigma was upon the archaeologists. Who were the Olmecs?
Robin Dre, Beats Bye.